Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Pollock, and I am so excited to welcome you to our webinar today, Mastering Manufacturing Automation with Acumatica, a part of our Acumatica education series presented by Scott Brindley. So before we get started, I want to go over just a few housekeeping items. Everyone has been placed on mute to keep the background noise to a minimum. However, throughout the webinar, you can ask any questions you have. If you'd like to submit a question, look for the question section in your GoToWebinar, and we're going to answer all those questions at the end of the presentation. In your GoToWebinar panel, you also have the ability to zoom into the presentation, change the layout, hide certain views. So if you're having any issues seeing, make sure to check that out. We're also recording this webinar, and it's going to be shared with everyone who was able to attend today, and also those who were unable to attend tomorrow afternoon. And then finally, we'd appreciate your participation in our closing poll and survey. With that said, we're thrilled that you've taken some time out of your busy day to be with us on this session. SWK is always here to help you fulfill your vision of a smarter and easier way to run your business by providing you with tools, support, software, and industry knowledge whenever you need it. So whether you're here to explore Acumatica manufacturing as a new solution, or you're here to learn more about automating your current Acumatica manufacturing processes, don't hesitate to ask any questions you have while the experts are present. And lastly, as a quick reminder, SWK is constantly sharing important updates and software tips and tricks on our social media channels. So give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter/X, Facebook, YouTube, so you don't miss out on more content like this. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
All right, thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate it. I'm Scott Brindley, and I am an Acumatica team lead with SWK. My specialties revolves around manufacturing, scheduling, and supply chain. And so we're going to go ahead and get started here and jump right into our presentation. So I'm going to just close down the camera during the presentation, but we'll turn it back on during Q&A. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll get started here. There we go. All right. So Acumatica, there's a lot of really good out-of-the-box manufacturing tools that are powerful and allow connections between sales orders, projects, purchase orders. There's a lot of automation that's built into the system, but a lot of times there's not always the automation exactly how we need it. A couple good examples of things that I get asked to do frequently are outside operations. So when you do an outside operation, you have to take and set up the bill of material to accommodate for the outside operation. Then you have to set up a purchase order for that particular vendor that you're going to do that operation with. And then from there, you have to receive the purchase order via a purchase receipt like normal. And then finally, you have to complete a move operation for the production order to be complete. And so it's very common that we'll set up a business event, which is a good way to do automation in Acumatica. And this business event will automatically do the move transaction for you after you've received the material in. Another good automation that we do for clients quite frequently is when you're linking together production orders and sub-assemblies within Acumatica. So an example of this is, say you have a sub-assembly that you need to do, a component that needs to go into your finished product. You would also create the main production order to be able to bring that sub-assembly in addition with other components, other sub-assemblies together. And a lot of times you want those linked together because they are dependent on each other. So we'll set up automation that if you were to change or remove or shift the dates on that, then you could automatically move those dates or delete the production order if it was appropriate. Now, the good news is Acumatica in these particular cases actually have those things as a feature in 24R2, but we're not there yet, and it still requires automation. So let's dive in a little bit to some of the out-of-box processes that are in Acumatica and how production orders work, and what are the opportunities for automation. So in the beginning here, the very first thing that we want to do is create a production order itself. And if we go to production order maintenance, we have the very first way is that we can go in and actually create a brand new production order by clicking the plus button and then selecting the appropriate things. So we can pick an order type, an inventory, warehouse, etc., to be able to create that production order manually. Now, this isn't the most exciting way to create a production order. There's a couple other ways that we can do it. And one of the other ways that we can do this is by going to a sales order. Within that sales order itself, there is a checkbox that allows us to mark it for production. In this case, I already have it done, but we can mark this for production, and then that will allow us to create a production order in the system. Now, the benefit of doing this is that you link the production order with the sales order. So if there's ever a change to the sales order, you would know that you might need to do a corresponding change to the sales order and the production, or you want to keep them in sync. And very, very important if you are having a situation where the customer says, hey, I need to push this order back, and they've requested a change. So you might not want to make it and hold on to that material because there could be other orders that are more important to fulfill because you've created an opportunity to be able to fulfill other orders quicker or be more likely to be on time. Or maybe you have a customer that says, I need to pull in or expedite an order. And so you want to have those two things linked so that way you can make sure that you're fulfilling the customer's need and you're not just moving the order, but also the product that you're going to make. Now, these are really great opportunities to automate. If you know this is part of your business process, then in here, there is a tool called Create Production Orders that's inside the sales order process itself. And if we go to Create Production Orders, we can create the order directly from here, but there's also a screen that's available in Production Orders under Processes called Create Production Orders. And this screen here will allow you to schedule or create all of the production orders that might be out there marked within the system. Now, one of the nice things about screens like this that are integrated within Acumatica is there is this automatic scheduler that's out there. And you can click this schedule button and you can click add, and it'll give you the opportunity to actually create a schedule of how often you want this to run. And this is some of the natural automated features that are within Acumatica. It's not something that you have to know code to do or be incredibly savvy with how the insides work of Acumatica. You do need permission to be able to do this, though. So if you're not able to do it, if you don't have permission to be able to schedule this, you can request permission from whoever's administering that. But it's a very light way to be able to have an automation happen where it's creating these orders for you versus doing them one by one as you're going through the production order process. Now, the other way that you can create a production order is by going into your by going into MRP. It's called now Inventory Planning and Display. That's one of the changes that Acumatica has done recently. And you can actually go here and find your items that you are planning to manufacture. You can click on them, and then you can create these production orders based on the recommendation of MRP. Now, the downside to having something like this, of having MRP do it, is it's not linked to the production order. You're just trying to fulfill a quantity that's out there. Now, it's really good for taking a single production order and consolidating multiple sales orders into it. So there's benefits for having it directly linked, and there's benefits for using MRP. But again, if you're using MRP, this is a perfect opportunity where you can go in and have the system automate that process where it's creating these production orders for you on a cadence automatically. Now, I do want to caution just a little bit about that type of activity. Really both of them, depending on how you do the automation. You need to think about the ramifications of creating those. So if you have a situation where they need to go under review, or there needs to be a confirmation, or maybe sometimes you need to make changes or adjustments to the order, this process might not necessarily work for you, because it's possible that you could create something that somebody starts producing and then you find out you have a problem, and it can just escalate from there. Now, there's a couple ways that you can produce orders within the system. Way number one is in here, is you can do a material transaction and or a labor transaction. Alternatively, you can do a clock entry, and then when you're complete with doing those, you can do a move transaction. Alternatively, you can do a move transaction, and if you have back flushing turned on, it'll automatically do those labor and material moves for you in the background. Now, this is something that's purposely set up based on your bill of material configuration, and while there are some opportunities for automation, likely the way that's working now is probably the way you want to keep it. Now, within the system itself, the question really is how do you know what materials are required? How do you know what materials are required out there for it? Well, the way Acumatica works is that you have a bill of material that's set up within the system. And within this bill of material itself, there are components that are within this that you can use, you can set up, and you can set up multiple materials based on different operations that are happening inside the system. And these usually go inside with the way that how your business works and how you're reporting. And there's a lot of decisions on to where you are planning on reporting and all that, and we're not going to get into that today, but just explaining how the bill of material process works, you're going to set up operations and you're going to set up material that is going to be used for those operations. Now, when you create this bill of material, that is your standard. That's what sits out there in Acumatica. And if we go to a production order, what will happen with this production order is at the time that you create it, it actually takes a snapshot of the order within the system and copies that bill of material. And notice that this looks very, very similar to how it was set up in the bill of material. It makes a copy. Now, you can actually edit and change this and deviate from it, and that works fine for some businesses, and it's part of their normal process. Now, we don't necessarily have to, I don't want to dig into that part of it today, but there is a whole methodology of when do you modify a production order bill of material versus leaving it alone and keeping it standard, and actually modify the actual bill of material itself. Now, part of the reason I bring this up is that if you're understanding where your material comes from, you can go into the system and see exactly what material is required. So in this particular case, to fulfill this production order, I would need one of this particular item, and I would need one of this item, and so on and so forth, all the way down to all the components that are needed to complete this. There's a few different ways that you can actually order material from the system, or have the system recommend material that can be ordered. And the good news is with those, there's a lot of automation that's available as well. So since I'm here, we'll talk about the first way, which is material that is on a production order. You can mark that material for PO, and you can see that this is exactly the case here for the production order itself. And all these items are marked for PO. And what's going to happen is similar to how we created a production order using that create production order screen, there is a create purchase order screen that works exactly the same way, that's under processes and create purchase orders. And so these items marked for PO will go in there. Now, the benefit to this is those items are actually linked to the production order itself. So it works really well for tracking to understand what material has been received, what materials are already here. And Acumatica provides some automation already in the system where when you receive it, automatically allocates that material to the production order. And production order material allocation is absolutely critical if you were picking components, or if you want to make sure you maintain availability of the components to that specific production order. And So the other portion that we have with this is if you're doing this for multiple production orders, then you can use that create production orders and automate that process of it creating POs for you. Now, if you want to do that, one of the things you'll need is to designate who the vendor is for them. Now, you can pick them if you're doing it manually, but if you're doing create purchase orders yourself, but if you're doing it from here and you want to automate that creation process, you'll need to go in and make sure that there's a primary vendor for each one of them, and that'll be the vendor it uses. Now, the downside to doing that is if you do automate that portion of it in Acumatica, there will be, and you want to pick a different vendor. The process to change the vendor is a little bit painful because now you have to remove it, you have to recreate it, and it might not necessarily be linked to the manufacturing order or the production order anymore. So you just want to be a little bit careful on how that process works and where you automate it. Now, the second way that you do it is in the sales order itself. There is an opportunity that you can mark it, just like you marked it for production, you can also mark it for PO. And you can click that box, and then at that point, you can create a purchase order, just like we created one for the production order. And you can compound this on top of it, where if you were marking some things for production and you are marking some things for production on the sale, marking some things for purchase on the sales order and marking some things for purchase on the production order, you could actually, when you do create purchase orders, it will pull it from both sources. And if they're a common item, it would put them on the same PO, which is really handy as well. Now, the benefit to doing that, again, is it's linked, and you can see it when it's received, and it's automatically allocated to the sales order at the time that you receive it. Now, the downside to doing that is that the sales order, or in the case of the production order, it holds those things hostage. And what I mean by that is it will not let you ship the item out, and it will not let you produce the production order until you've received that material in through the purchase order. And that's part of the thing that can really be tricky. So you get that automatic allocation, which is incredibly helpful. The downside is you have to make sure that that purchase order is received. And hopefully the way you're doing this process and the way your business works is you are purposely choosing to link those because that's part of your process. You're not going to start the order until the material is received. However, exceptions do happen and they do apply. And part of the issue with that, or part of the things that can happen, is that maybe you receive one material in and then you didn't receive enough of the material, and so the next order that's coming in, you might want to use a little bit of that if it's a common component to be able to complete the other order until you can get them caught up. And you don't want to hold that particular production order hostage or that sales order hostage until the next order comes in. It could be weeks or months away. So you need an ability to be able to switch and change that allocation when you receive it, or to be able to just make a change. And you can definitely make that change. And there's a couple ways that you can do it. Way number one is you go to the actual production order itself, and you can simply remove the link. And then that purchase order, when you receive it, it'll then be material that you can manually allocate to either way you go. The other way is you can delete the production order line and recreate it under you can recreate, I want to make sure I say that right. You can delete the purchase order line, and then from there you can go in and recreate the PO as needed, or manually create the PO as needed, depending on which one you do. Now, both of those are really painful and not necessarily something you want to do every day. The other thing that can happen is where this allocation might not be the greatest idea is you might have, even though you're directly buying the material to be associated with a particular purchase order or sales order, there could be a minimum order quantity. And in the case of a minimum order quantity, your problem is, what do you do with the excess inventory? And so now you're stuck with another painful process. You have to manually unmark those. If you have to manually unmark those for purchase, or you have to start using the material. You're canceling purchase order lines, and now you have some linkage in the system that's broken or not working, and you're changing your processes. And so all of these things, you can manage them. You can manage them manually, but they are quite painful. And so that comes into a specific use case that I ran into earlier this year. And it's where you want to live in both worlds, where you want to automatically allocate material on receipt, but you also want to take advantage of MRP's processes that happen, so you don't have to directly link the purchase order to the sales order, or directly to the production order, specifically in the production order in this case. And so that's where we can live in between and manually, or not manually, but we can automatically allocate the material without it being tied together. So let's just show you real quick how that process works manually, and then we can show you what you can do to automate it if you're interested in doing this. And so if I were to allocate material manually to a production order, I would go into the production order, I would find the one I'm looking for. In this case, I'm just going to pick the first one on the list. I can go to production order detail. And if I happen to know the production order and type and all that stuff, I can skip ahead and go straight to production order detail, but I'm a creature of habit, and I always tend to go to the production order maintenance first. And then you'll find the operation, and you'll find the line that you're talking about, and you'll go to line details. And this will show you if the material has been allocated or not. Now, again, if it was marked for PO, and I know this marked for PO checkbox is checked, I manually unallocated it earlier, but normally that checkbox wouldn't be checked, and this shows you what is required. Now, if there's material available to allocate this, you can check the box, you can hit OK, and the system, when you save it, will show you that, or will have the material allocated. And so we can see that that stayed there, it's allocated. And if we were to go to allocation details, it would show it that the material is allocated out there. So we can see that it's allocated for this particular production order that we were just looking at. Okay. So that is the manual part. Now, if we have an issue where we want to unallocate material and reallocate material, or if there's a partial receipt, then what you have to do to manually do this is you have to go in, find the next production order that's in sequence, allocate the material to that particular item, go to a different production order that might have it in sequence, allocate it to that particular one, and then you can rinse and repeat that for every single production order that material was used on, and rinse and repeat it for every material that you've just received. Horrible process. You do not want to do that. You do not want to do that manually, and it wouldn't make sense to do that manually. So this is a perfect opportunity to be able to automate. And so the way that we would automate it, or the way we need to think about automating that, is how would we pick what order we are going to actually allocate the material to. And so that's the thing that you would do no matter what process you're picking. You would think, well, how am I going to, if I'm going to do this manually, what decisions am I going to make? And that's a perfect place to start when you're considering automation. And so in this particular case, we have a whole list of production orders. And we might say, well, I want to do the oldest production order first, or the oldest sales order first, depending on how you're linking those together. And one of the best ways to determine that, and one of the best ways for a business event to be set up, is to drive it based off of a GI, because you have a lot of control over how that GI works. Now, you can base it off of the actual screen and when you actually do the action and all that, and you can kind of compound those things. But in this particular instance, we're going to base it off of a generic inquiry. And so I have one set up already, and it is my allocation to production order. And we can see here that there is a few things. Let's clean up the screen a little bit so you can see things a little bit easier. I just want to make sure that, okay. So within this particular item, we are sorting it based on a couple different factors. And let's actually go right into the details of the inquiry so you can see what's happening. So right now we have the sort order based on the material inventory item, the production item status, and then the production item end date, and then the start date. And so the reason that we're doing that for this particular inquiry is that we're making business, we're linking it with the business rules and how we're making decisions. So in this particular case, we're saying, okay, we're going to take this particular material and we're going to have that done first. Then from there, we're going to do it based on the status of the production order. So maybe the production order has already been released, the production order is in planning. It would have different statuses. So we're going to base it off of that. And then we're going to base it off of the end date of the production item. Now, something to think about with this, with the production item, the end date that's in there, if you're not linking that production item or you're not maintaining that inside the system to be linked with the sales order, then you're going to get misjoins. So going back to what I talked about earlier, what happens if a customer calls in and needs to push back an order or expedite an order, and now you're allocating material to your production order? Those two things become desynced, and the next thing you know, you are allocating material to a production order you don't need to produce yet, or worse yet, you're not allocating it to a production order that you need to produce immediately or sooner than expected. So part of the automation too, and something to consider, is think about how your operations are going and how you can maintain information in the system to be accurate and up to date. And I'll talk about that more in a moment, how MRP can help you with that, but just something to consider when you're going through these types of activities. So we're sorting it based on that. And then let's go ahead and view the inquiry again. And within the inquiry itself, I have it sorted that way. And so our next step is we're going to create a business event that is going to look at this and then go in and do an import to allocate the material for it. But I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. One of the things I like to do, and you don't necessarily have to do it this way, is I like to create the import scenario first, then actually do the business event. And the reason I like to do that is because I can test out the import scenario first, make some tweaks to it. Then that way I'm putting the finished product, if you will, in the business event. It also is useful for troubleshooting later, because if I have to figure out, well, what happened? Why is this happening? Where did it go? I can go in and link. I can go in and test that out and see if the failure is happening when I'm doing the import. The information that you get from Acumatica isn't always clear, and sometimes it's spotty, and unfortunately, we have to work around those things, but also it gives us an opportunity to dive into the details and understand what's going on too. So if we were to look at the integration itself, just so you get a look at this import scenario, give me just a moment because I have to pull up this particular one. Okay, production. Okay, this is our business event here. Just taking a moment to pull up. Okay, so this is how our event is set up. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky event, and I don't want to dive into the absolute details of it, but I did want to pull it open so you could see exactly how this looked in the way it was set up. Because if you remember going to the production order, there's multiple levels within there you have to go. You have to know how to go to the production order. The system has to know how to go to the actual production order itself. It needs to know what operation. So you got the order and the type. It needs to know what operation that you need to do. Then it needs to know what line item it needs to do within that operation. And then it also needs to go in and look at, well, how am I going to actually allocate it? Like, what is it? How is it going to put that in there? And so each of these steps in here within it are going to narrow that down and use the information on our inquiry. And just a quick note for the more, it's something to look into from an advanced perspective. Using an at is what we call it, is a good way to kind of bypass the import scenario process. Instead of using just the required fields, you can use a designated field that isn't required or isn't necessarily a key field that you can then select and have that updated. It's incredibly useful when you're doing stuff like if you're in the stock item screen and you're trying to update the vendor portion in the submenu in the stock item screen, you can actually narrow that down. So that's very common with import scenarios. But this is what the import scenario would look like. Now within that, once I have the import scenario itself done, then I would go to the business event itself, business events, and we'll pull this up. Give it just a moment here. Let's just pull the active ones. And then we would have update production order allocation. So this event would run, and in this particular case, we have it scheduled to run. It's going to be based on a schedule, and we're going to trigger it based on a group of records. In this particular one, if you're trying to mimic or emulate exactly what we did here, we did need to group it based on the inventory number, because what we didn't want to do is go into a production order and allocate all of the material that's needed for that particular production order based on the order of it. So there's two different ways that you can sort things out. You can say, well, I want to sort it by the material, or I want to sort it by the production order. Well, you could have something that's technically on a production order that's, I don't know, 10, 12, 30 days, however long. It's older than the material that actually needs to be allocated to it. Or you have the material that is on something that's a newer order, or an order that's due in the future that you don't necessarily want to allocate material from. So we wanted to strictly allocate based on the material itself. Now that could be different, and you could say, well, I don't want to allocate anything unless I can allocate the whole thing to the production order and make it available. That's something completely different and not what we're showing here. But that the order of operation, again, is incredibly important. You just want to think about, how do I do it manually versus how do I automate it? For subscribers, we're just going to the production, the business event import, the import scenario that we're going to create and linking that. And then our schedule will be set where we're doing this every hour is when we're doing this activity. And you could make this happen more frequently, less frequently, depending on what makes sense for your business or your process. Now, the good thing about doing this activity and having this event run is now we can take advantage of MRP and what's out there. So we can go in and say, well, if material is received in and we have excess, we can allocate it to the next production order. If we have a shortage, we can have it allocate as much as it possibly can. But it also gives us some extra information based on availability. And so if we look at some opportunities that we have out there, then if we were to look at a report that we created called Allocated Production Material, this goes out and looks at every single production order that's out there and tells me what has been allocated and what hasn't been allocated. So now I have a status that I can see, well, what production orders are basically ready to make and which ones are still waiting on material. And so we have a couple different tabs up here. One is ready to build. So this means that this particular order is ready to build. It has all the material on it and is ready to produce. Then we have things that are not ready and it's missing some type of components and material. And then in addition, we have things that have been released and that we've already, you can see that they have ready to build on them. And so this is a really cool status dashboard. Now you don't necessarily have to do the automation to take advantage of this. If you are strictly linking your production order to your purchase orders to your production orders, then you can have that automate. You can do this similar report to it. But in this particular case, we like using this. Now, additional automation that we've done is that we automatically release production orders that have all the material ready to build. And so if there is something that was in here in the status where it says ready to build, we have a business event that can run in the background that automatically releases it, and then production knows that they have all the material on hand ready to build. Now on the opposite side of things, just kind of giving you a tour here, if we were to look at something like this, we have an additional report called Allocated Production Material Detail, and this drives down into the actual order itself, and you can see, well, what is missing. And in this particular case, the second item is not allocated. It doesn't have any material in it. And so we know that we need to use, we need to find out what's going on with that. Maybe the vendor didn't deliver on time. Maybe it needs to be expedited. Maybe it's allocated to a different production order for whatever reason. And we can actually look at that. So if we grab a copy of the component ID here, we can update this material, look at the component for everything that this is allocated for, and we can see if there was other items that actually were allocated, then we could take and rob Peter to pay Paul, if you will. Now, the reason I bring this up is this is another thing that you can automate that's in the system. You can automate the system by going in and giving you notifications when you have items that only have a couple things that are missing, or if there's a certain threshold that's there and you want to try to complete and move these orders ahead. That's an opportunity that you can do as well. Now, the other thing that you would want to consider when you're automating these types of operations is looking at MRP and making sure that everything is up to date and is current as possible. So a lot of times with clients, I'll see things where maybe their practices of releasing orders isn't as timely as it should be, or maybe that they aren't completing transactions all the way because there was an issue, or because somebody just created like an adjustment and just sitting out there and they haven't released it yet. All of these things influence MRP, and managing that is a good way to make things simpler, but also allow you to do more automation. And so one of the things that you can consider is on things like this, you can create a dashboard. So for this, you could definitely create a dashboard that shows you what things are unallocated, and you can manage that. But also from an MRP side, if we go to inventory planning, we've created a dashboard that shows you what things are out there and what things are ready to be produced. So in this particular, what things are needed to be able to do things. So we have sales orders that are past due, which would drive MRP. And this is something that you can set up automations for to get notifications and help you drive and keep those things down. Same thing with past due purchase orders, or past due production orders, or inventory transactions that are not happening. So this particular snapshot is kind of old, so I'm not surprised to see the fact that some of these things are actually showing as past due, given the age of it. All right, so I appreciate everybody listening in here as I'm going through some of the automations. I know we took some big leaps in logic, but if you break down the concept of what we have here, I'm hoping that you can take some of that away and use it to improve some of your own processes and make them more automated. And I want to turn it back over to Christina so she can, to Courtney, so then that way she can tell you all some of the next steps.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. There was so much great information there. I'm sure some people out in the audience have some questions. So we're going to pop back to our presentation deck and dive into Q&A and a quick poll, and then we'll wrap up. So go ahead and get any of your questions into the Q&A portion of the GoToWebinar panel, and we're going to dive in. So Scott, one of the questions that I had come in is that, I don't know if we've mentioned it yet, but some people on the audience might have heard that we have a manufacturing process review. So can you tell me a little bit about what that is and what it's like?
Yeah, not a problem. So the manufacturing process review, there's a multiple things when you're using an ERP system. So if you can just use Acumatica and you can follow a manual, but really taking advantage of Acumatica is understanding how your actual processes dive in, and then also linking those with how you use Acumatica. So a good example is what we were just showing, where you have your trying to automate a process where we're linking production orders and purchase orders together. Well, that might not actually work for your business. You might not want to link those together. It sounds like a really good idea, but it might not make sense. So that process review identifies how you do things in the system, and does it make sense to use certain features, or for different reasons. So an important thing is comparing what you're doing to best practices as well. So you're not just somebody saying, well, this is how you use Acumatica, but how do best practices work? And so that assessment gives you all the tools you need to be able to configure Acumatica appropriately. So
that makes a lot of sense. And with that, while we've got those questions coming in, I want to run a quick poll for the audience. So out there in the audience, we'd appreciate your participation. Just asking, what's your next step in optimizing your manufacturing process? So are you interested in getting that manufacturing process review? Would you like to get some help setting up some of those automations and general inquiries that were shared with us today? And then we also have that MRP. So are you interested in adding the manufacturing resource planning to your license? So there's a lot of different things we can do. I know Scott covered a lot, so we're able to help you, get some of those automations in GI set up if that's something you don't want to take on yourself, or that process for the review to really dive in. Okay, perfect.
One of the other things is not everybody has an MRP license. Now, Acumatica did, in the most recent version of Acumatica, add something called distribution requirements planning. So you don't necessarily have to have manufacturing to take advantage of MRP, which has always been an issue in the past, where I had a couple clients purchase manufacturing just so they can get the MRP license. So if you don't have production, you could still take advantage of this inventory planning or MRP thing as well, and get the distribution requirements planning. Really, really excited about that, because it was always a pain before to get that. I think there's a lot of cheering. There's two things everybody cheered in Summit this year, and that was one of them. So
that's good to know. I think we've got, let me double check. I think we've got, you must have just done too thorough of an explanation, Scott, because we don't have a ton of questions out there in the audience today. Is there, before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to touch on? Or we're just going to...
Yeah, just when you're automating, I know I said this a couple times during the presentation, but when you're automating things, just consider the implications of automating them. More importantly, think about how this process is going to be automated itself. How would you do it manually? Because it's always a good way to think, well, if I can't do this manually, how am I supposed to do this automatically? And so taking that approach to it and thinking about it definitely makes a big difference. So
that's a great tip. So with that, I think we'll head on over to our thank you slide. We really appreciate everyone taking some time out of their day to be with us on this session, and we hope you discovered something new today. SWK is always here to help you, give you new information. So you can always, go to our website at swktech.com. We have a ton of Acumatica resources there. Our blog, we're constantly putting out new information on different tips, best practices, things like that. And you can always reach us at info@swktech.com or your SWK rep if you do want to, get that process review or any of these other automations, GIs. We're always here to help you, make the system work the best way it can for you. And Scott is, I think really our expert in manufacturing automation, and he is always here to, with his expertise. So if you think of a question after the webinar, reach out to us. And with that, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you so much, Scott.
all right, thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.